She was 22 years old when she walked into the most powerful building in the world. And she was still 22 when that building decided it no longer needed her. That is the fact that sits at the center of this story. Not the relationship. Not the recordings. Not the blue dress. The age. Because what happened to Monica Lewinsky between 1995 and 1998 did not happen to a peer of the most powerful man in the United States. It happened to a 22-year-old intern on her first professional assignment. And the gap between those two facts, who she was and what she was subjected to, is one that the coverage of the time largely refused to hold in focus at the same time. She had graduated from Lewis and Clark College and arrived at the White House in 1995 as an unpaid intern, assigned to the Office of Legislative Affairs. On paper, it was a routine placement. The kind of position that looks impressive on a resume and involves a great deal of copying, scheduling, and learning to move quietly through halls where important people are always in a hurry. But the West Wing is never just about job descriptions. It is about proximity. Who you pass in the corridor, whose name you learn to recognize by voice before you ever meet them face to face. And Monica Lewinsky, within months, was not passing through those corridors anonymously. Her access expanded at a rate that most interns in that building would never experience. She moved from routine administrative duties into closer contact with senior staffers. She was later transferred into a paid position within the Office of Chief of Staff Leon Panetta, a role that placed her directly adjacent to the executive inner circle. In an institution where physical proximity to the president operates as a form of informal currency, this was a significant elevation for someone who had arrived without a title, without clearance history, and without the years of political relationships that typically define White House access. Between late 1995 and early 1996, her interactions with President Bill Clinton began to shift. According to later testimony and the extensive investigative records assembled by independent counsel Kenneth Starr, encounters between the two occurred within restricted West Wing areas, near the Oval Office, in adjacent rooms used for meetings and brief personal breaks. What began as professional familiarity became something else. Something private. Something that no official record documented and no public indicator suggested. The White House during that period was already operating under significant political pressure from ongoing investigations linked to earlier controversies in Clinton's career. Discretion was not simply a preference inside those walls. It was infrastructure. By mid-1996, something inside the building shifted. Staff members later noted concerns about Lewinsky's access patterns and the frequency of her presence in restricted areas. The response was administrative and swift. In July of 1996, she was reassigned to the Pentagon, officially transferred into a public affairs role at the Department of Defense. The paperwork described it as a routine personnel rotation. And that is not accidental language. Routine. Rotation. Bureaucratic framing applied to a decision that was anything but. She was 22 years old and she had been moved out of proximity to the most powerful office in the United States. Communication between her and Clinton continued for a period after that transfer, but it now took place outside the visibility of White House staff. And that shift, from internal to external, from observable to unobserved, became the condition under which everything that followed would eventually be reconstructed, piece by piece, by federal investigators who were, at that point, looking for something else entirely. Kenneth Starr had been appointed to investigate the Whitewater real estate controversy, a financial matter involving both Bill and Hillary Clinton from years earlier. That is where the inquiry began. What it became is a different story. And the mechanism by which it became that story runs directly through a woman named Linda Tripp. Tripp was a former White House employee who had moved to the Pentagon, the same building where Lewinsky had been reassigned. Between 1996 and 1997, Tripp recorded a series of private phone conversations with Lewinsky, without her knowledge, driven, according to Tripp's own account, by concern that Lewinsky was being encouraged to conceal details of her interactions with the president. Those recordings, audio tapes handed directly to Starr's investigators, captured detailed admissions and descriptions of encounters that linked Lewinsky to Clinton in explicit terms. They transformed a private narrative into a matter of federal investigation. Lewinsky has since spoken publicly about her decision to confide in Tripp. She trusted her. That is the detail that tends to get overlooked in discussions of the legal mechanics of how the scandal emerged. She was a 24-year-old woman working in a government building, navigating an experience that she had no framework for and no one to discuss it with safely, or so she believed. The tapes were not a product of carelessness. They were a product of trust misplaced. That word, trust, sits at the center of this story in more than one direction. And it was not accidental. It was chosen by someone who had years to decide what they wanted to say. But Tripp's recordings were not the only evidence Starr's office would eventually work with. Among the most significant pieces of physical evidence was a navy blue dress belonging to Lewinsky that had been preserved, not cleaned, after one of her encounters with Clinton. Forensic testing of biological material found on the garment produced laboratory results that directly linked the dress to President Clinton. In a case built heavily on testimony, recorded conversations, and documentation, the dress provided one of the few tangible, scientifically tested points of corroboration. In January of 1998, during a deposition in the separate Paula Jones harassment lawsuit, President Clinton was placed under oath and asked directly about his relationship with Lewinsky. He denied it categorically. He stated that no such relationship had occurred and that he had not engaged in such conduct with her. That sworn statement would become one of the central legal pressure points of the investigation, not because it was surprising, but because it now existed on the record, in direct conflict with audio recordings, witness statements, and physical forensic evidence. That is not the posture of someone who did not understand what was at stake. It is the posture of someone who made a calculated decision about what the available evidence could prove, and bet on it. The Starr report was delivered to Congress in September of 1998. It ran over 400 pages. It detailed the timeline of the relationship, the evidence collected, and the allegations of perjury and obstruction of justice. Within hours of its public release, the report dominated every major media outlet in the United States and across international markets. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Newspapers placed Lewinsky's name on front pages globally. For a 24-year-old former intern who had spent 2 years attempting to navigate a federal investigation in relative silence, the shift was not gradual. It was instantaneous. This was the late 1990s. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News were in the middle of an intense competition for breaking political coverage. The 24-hour news cycle had become the dominant format. And Lewinsky's story arrived at the precise moment when that format was hungry enough to consume it entirely and loop it endlessly. Late-night hosts built entire monologues around her name. Editorial cartoonists reduced her to a single image repeated across hundreds of papers. International outlets translated the coverage into dozens of languages, each one amplifying the same compressed, decontextualized narrative. The most powerful man in the country had denied it under oath. His career, bruised but intact, continued forward. The 24-year-old woman at the center of it lost the ability to exist in public without being recognized for it. By December of 1998, the House of Representatives had approved articles of impeachment against President Clinton, citing perjury and obstruction of justice. He became only the second president in United States history to be impeached. The Senate trial concluded in 1999 with an acquittal. Clinton completed his second term. Lewinsky spent most of the following decade trying to exist quietly. Employment became difficult in ways that were never named directly but were consistently present. Reports from the period indicate that employers were hesitant to associate with her. She relocated away from Washington, D.C. She lived in New York for a period and eventually spent time abroad, including years in London, attempting to create physical distance from a media environment that had embedded her identity so deeply into a single story that the story had effectively become her identity. In 2006, she completed a Master of Science degree in social psychology at the London School of Economics. Her academic focus was stigma, group behavior, and identity formation, the study of how individuals become fixed in the perception of social systems and what it costs them when they do. That choice of subject is not incidental. You do not spend years studying stigma and identity without having a specific, lived reason for needing to understand both. For most of the 2000s, she remained largely outside the public frame. That changed in 2014 when she published an essay in Vanity Fair titled Shame and Survival. It was her first major public reflection on the scandal in years, and it reframed the experience deliberately, not as political controversy, not as legal history, but as a sustained exercise in public humiliation, one that had taken place before social media existed and yet anticipated every mechanism that social media would later make routine. The essay arrived at a specific cultural moment. Online harassment had become a widely discussed phenomenon. Cyberbullying was no longer a fringe concern but a mainstream crisis. And Lewinsky's account of what it felt like to have your identity reduced to a single event, and then have that event repeated to you indefinitely across every available media channel suddenly had a new context in which to be heard. If you have ever watched something from 20 years ago define how people perceive someone in the present, watched a person try to walk forward while a narrative runs behind them on a loop, you understand precisely what that kind of sustained exposure does to the project of building a life. She began speaking at universities, global conferences, and corporate forums. She worked with organizations focused on digital safety and media ethics. She consulted with production teams, participated in documentary projects that revisited the Clinton era as cultural history rather than partisan political material, and took on advisory roles that allowed her to operate within media systems while also analyzing them from the outside. By her early 50s, her estimated net worth had been placed in a range of $1 to $2 million, built gradually across public speaking fees, writing projects, production collaborations, and consulting work. Not the explosive financial trajectory of someone who monetised a scandal. The steady accumulation of someone who rebuilt, carefully, across decades. That distinction matters. Because the version of this story that the media constructed in 1998 was built around a single event. The version that has emerged across the 30 years since is built around what someone does when that event is used to define them permanently and they choose not to accept the definition. She was the entry-level employee. He was the president. She was the one who lost her ability to exist professionally in Washington, who could not get hired, who relocated twice, who spent her late 20s and early 30s managing the consequences of something that happened when she was 22. And she was the one who then spent 2 decades building an intellectual and advocacy framework around exactly the kind of power imbalance that had shaped her experience, without naming it as grievance, without positioning it as vendetta. She built it as analysis, as scholarship, as public contribution. The person who seemed not to survive this story was the one who was 22. The person who actually did was the same one. At 52, Monica Lewinsky's name no longer belongs only to 1998. It belongs to a conversation about how institutions protect themselves, how media systems consume individuals, how silence is sometimes chosen not out of shame but out of strategy, and what it looks like when someone who had every reason to be defined by a single moment decides, quietly, persistently, over 3 decades, to be defined by everything that came after it instead. Was she a pawn in a political story that was never really about her? Or did she find, in the aftermath of being used, something that the people who used her never anticipated? A voice that grew more credible, not less, the longer she waited to use it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.